In this video, we're going to be looking at what is meant by poverty and the different types of poverty, as well as the Henderson poverty line. Just to start off with, this is a diagram that basically just shows the amount of tax and the amount of assistance that's given to different households within Australia, and it gives you a better indication of a kind of how the how the different incomes work. So you can see here, this one here, whatever's below the line represents the amount of tax they're paying, and whatever's above the line represents the assistance that they're getting from the government. So you can see this is the lowest quintile. In terms of the tax on their income, you can barely actually see it because they pay next to no tax. This is income tax, where the second pay a little bit of income tax, and then because of our progressive tax system, it increases until you get to the fifth quintile. Most of the taxes that the low income earners pay is indirect taxes. So GST, petrol excise taxes, carbon tax, not carbon tax anymore, petrol excise, cigarettes, tobacco. So that's the taxes that, if you remember Duncan from the video on Q&A, he gave the types of taxes that he's complaining about. But because rich people still spend more, they do pay more indirect tax, but as a percentage of their income, indirect taxes is much higher for low income earners. And that's why we refer to it as a regressive tax. But you can see income tax is clearly progressive. It's going up considerably the more that we earn. So the low income earners are paying around, say, $100 tax per week, whereas, per month, this is all by month, where your highest tax income earners are paying up to sort of $1,000 in tax. As you go up, then you've got all your different types of assistance that different households are receiving. So you've got the social assistance and other benefits. So this would be your gross income, your cash benefits. As you can see, the highest quintile barely receive any cash benefits. The maroon, or whatever you want to call it, is education benefits, which is pretty much very even for each of the quintiles. So all the different quintiles receive quite a lot of educational benefits. Health benefits, well, most of these people will be in the public health system in the lowest quintile, so it does get a little bit lower the more we go. And then you've got your other benefits, so that would be your public housing, concession cards and things like that, which is still biggest for the lowest income group. So you can sort of give you a breakdown of how much government assistance the government provide, as well as the amount of tax that the government's collecting from different areas. Incidence of poverty. Poverty refers to people living in a situation where they have insufficient means to adequately provide for themselves. And there are essentially two types of poverty. Okay, so we need to work out what actually poverty means. So it doesn't mean you can't purchase enough for soft drink. Doesn't mean you're in poverty if you can only afford a very old car. What does it actually mean to be in poverty? And there are two types of poverty you need to be aware of. There's what we call absolute poverty, and this is the one that we want to avoid in Australia. This is the one that we want to avoid as part of our goal. And that occurs when a person or a household has insufficient income to purchase the basic necessities. So this is when people don't have enough income to basically provide for them food, clothing and shelter for them or their kids. So this one we want to avoid. Relative poverty is always going to exist. We accept that there will be some relative poverty. And this is the definition of relative poverty is just when a person or household has a low level of income compared to other individuals or households, or what society agrees as a dignified standard of living. So in Australia, we basically refer to someone in relative poverty if they're earning less than 60% of the average income. So relative poverty occurs when a person or household has a low income compared to other individuals or households. It's always it's relative. Absolute poverty is the one we want to avoid. How do we calculate relative poverty? We use something called the Henderson poverty line. So the Henderson poverty line is a benchmark level of income for various households to determine whether they're in relative poverty or not. So if you're above the line, you're not in relative poverty. If you're below the line, then you're in relative poverty. And we'll show you what that means. As a relative measure, the Henderson poverty line increases over time to ensure that there's a fixed proportion of the average household disposable income. So the Henderson poverty line basically represents about 60% of average income. So if you have a look at this graph, the blue line represents the Henderson poverty line. So anybody that's earning less than that amount at that point in time is living in what we call relative poverty. So if you're in this area below the line, you're in relative poverty. So for a household with 2 adults and 2 kids, that's what we're talking about here, if you're earning less than around $900 for the whole family, you would be under the poverty line. So in 2013, a household with 2 adults and 2 children, if it's less than 946, they're in relative poverty. Now, that's not absolute poverty. It doesn't mean that they can't afford basic food and education and clothing, it means they're in relative poverty compared to the average wage. In 1974, the relative poverty line was around $62.70. So with inflation, that's gone up. But what's happened is the average, and this is the bit where it gets a little bit tricky, the average wages in Australia have gone up at a faster rate than CPI inflation. So the black line represents inflation and how much prices have gone up. The blue line represents the average wage. And as you can see, the average wage is going at a faster rate than the average, than inflation. And what that actually means to conceptualise is that Australians are getting richer. So if you're earning 60% of the average income, even though you're not by any means rich, you're actually better off today than what you were back in the 1970s, because the average income has gone up by more than inflation. So if you're below 60% of that, or let's say you're right on the Henderson poverty line, you're much better off than what you were back in the 70s, because you've got a higher percentage, well, you've got 60% of a much higher income in real terms. So what we're basically saying is those living in relative poverty, if you're right on the line, are $309 better off in real terms than they were in 1974. So in Australia in recent times, average real GDP per capita incomes have been rising at a faster rate than CPI. This means that the average Australian can purchase more goods and services, and those living on the Henderson poverty line have a higher real GDP per capita or more purchasing power than they did back in the 1970s. So you can see here, this represents what you have to be working to be above the Henderson poverty line. So if you're below 945, you're in relative poverty in Australia. But as you can see, this Henderson poverty line is growing at a faster rate than inflation, than price. This is representing what the average wage would be if wages just went up with inflation since the 1970s. So $545. So the Henderson poverty line is growing at a much faster rate, this column here, than the average than average prices are going up, which basically means that people are on, if they're in relative poverty, are better off than they were back in the 1970s by around 73%. And here's what you have to be this is what you have to be on to be under the Henderson poverty line in Australia. So a couple with 2 children if you're earning less than $961. If you're a couple with 4 children, $1,237. A single person earning less than $511 would be in relative poverty, and a couple with $684.